November 1542. Inside the Forbidden City, the most powerful man on earth is asleep, and he is not in his own bed. He is in the quarters of one of his consorts, a woman named Cao, because by now the Emperor of China has learned that even the choice of where he closes his eyes must be a secret. A fixed bed is a target. An unpredictable one might keep him alive. He does not know that tonight the precaution will fail, and that it will fail from the one direction no wall was built to stop. 16 of the women who serve him move through the dark. They are palace attendants, the people who bring his water and tend his rooms, the people whose faces he barely registers. One of them, a woman named Yang Jin-ying, carries a cord braided from silk ribbon and hemp. They hold him down. The cord goes around his neck, and they pull. He does not die. He should have. The knot was tied wrong, looped so that it would not draw closed, and as the rope bit into his throat, the emperor lost consciousness rather than his life. The most powerful man in the world was saved by a bad knot. That night would change how the emperors of China slept for the rest of the dynasty. It is the true seed of a legend you may have heard, the claim that the Emperor of China never slept in the same room twice. The truth underneath the legend is stranger and sadder than the slogan. The man at the center of the empire lived in genuine, justified fear of the people closest to him. His bedroom was not a place of rest. It was a security system. Stay with this, and you will see how one November night turned a bedchamber into a machine for staying alive, and why the women who tried to kill him were driven to it. To understand how 16 unarmed women came within a bad knot of ending a dynasty's reigning emperor, you have to understand the man and the court around him. His name was Zhu Hotsong, and history knows him as the Jiajing Emperor Jiajing. He came to the throne in 1521, a boy of 14, and he came to it sideways. He was not the son of the previous emperor. He was a cousin, a collateral heir pulled from a provincial princedom, because the ruling line had produced no surviving son. From his first days on the throne, he was a young man surrounded by officials who had not chosen him and who expected to manage him. They were wrong about that. The boy emperor spent his early reign locked in a bitter, years-long confrontation with his own court, a dispute the histories call the Great Rites controversy. On its surface, it was a quarrel about ritual, about whether the new emperor should honor his own dead father as an emperor or defer to the memory of the uncle whose throne he had inherited. Underneath, it was a raw contest of will between a teenager with absolute title and a bureaucracy that believed it held the real power. Jiajing won. He forced the court to honor his father his way, and he learned a lesson that would shape everything after. The people who served him were not loyal. They were obstacles, and they could be broken. If a court that ran on this much fear and this much silence is the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing. The record these dynasties left behind is deep, and there is always another door in the palace that has not yet been opened. By the 1540s, the emperor who had won that fight had turned away from the business of ruling. He became consumed by Taoist alchemy, by the search for physical immortality, for elixirs and rituals that promised to extend his life without limit. He surrounded himself with Taoist priests and a handful of favored grand secretaries, and he withdrew from the daily governance of the empire into a private world of incense, scripture, and the pursuit of a life that would never end. It is one of the grim ironies of his reign that a man so afraid of death, so desperate to cheat it, made himself the target of an assassination inside his own home. The palace he ruled from was the Forbidden City in Beijing, the vast walled compound that was both the seat of government and the private residence of the imperial family. Behind its red walls and moats lived a population of thousands, almost none of whom had chosen to be there. There were officials and guards, but the great mass of the inner court was made up of two groups. The eunuchs, the castrated men who staffed the imperial household and controlled access to the emperor, and the palace women, the enormous body of consorts, attendants, and servants who kept the inner court running. For the emperor, this was the fundamental problem of his existence. He was the single point on which the entire empire balanced. and he was surrounded, every hour of every day and night, by hundreds of people he did not choose and could not fully trust. In daylight, in his robes, ringed by guards, he was the untouchable center of the world. But every night he had to become something else. He had to lie down, close his eyes, and be, for a few hours, an unconscious and unarmed man in a room full of other people. The bedchamber was the one place where all his power counted for nothing. The system that grew up around Imperial sleep existed to solve exactly that vulnerability. To see how far it went, you have to look at where an emperor actually slept. In the Ming Dynasty, the emperor's formal residence was the Palace of Heavenly Purity, Jiajing, one of the great halls along the central axis of the Forbidden City. From the outside, it read as a single grand throne hall of an imperial bedroom. Inside, it was something far more deliberate. The sleeping space was divided into a grid of small, curtained alcoves, spread across 2 floors, traditionally described as around 9 partitioned rooms, holding dozens of separate bed positions. The emperor did not have a bed. He had a choice of many, and which one he actually occupied on a given night was not fixed, not scheduled, and not publicly known. This was not luxury for its own sake. It was concealment built into architecture. A would-be assassin, even one already inside the palace, could not know which curtain to part. The empty beds were decoys. The real security was the uncertainty, the fact that on any given night, the single most valuable target in the empire could be behind any one of dozens of curtains, and only a tiny handful of people knew which. On the night in 1542, Jiajing was not even in the Palace of Heavenly Purity. He was sleeping in the quarters of Consort Cao, and that too was part of the design. Moving unpredictably between residences, sleeping in a consort's rooms rather than his own, spread the uncertainty wider still. The emperor's location at night was treated as a state secret because, quite literally, it was one. Around that concealed center stood rings of control, each one a layer between the sleeping emperor and the world. Closest to him were the eunuchs, the household servants who attended his person directly. Beyond them stood the palace guards. Beyond them, the walls, the gates, the moats. And threaded through the whole household ran further precautions that had nothing to do with sleep. The tasting of the imperial kitchens against poison. The strict control of who could approach the emperor and when. The entire apparatus was engineered on a single assumption, and that assumption was about to be proven both correct and fatally incomplete. The court had built its defenses to keep a threat out. It had never seriously reckoned with a threat that was already inside, that it had let in itself, that it dressed and fed and stationed a few feet from the emperor's pillow. To understand why the people inside turned, you have to look at what life inside that system was actually like, and who paid for the emperor's pursuit of immortality. Life among the palace women under Jiajing was governed by fear. They were beaten for the smallest faults, for a spilled cup or a slow response, or an offense invisible to anyone above them, and they were worked hard on meager rations that left them weak. Above all, they were exploited in the service of the emperor's alchemy. The pursuit of immortality was not an abstract hobby carried out in some distant temple. It made physical demands, and those demands fell on the bodies and the labor of the women of the inner court. They were the raw material of a rich man's attempt to live forever, and they were kept hungry while they served it. This is the crucial thing to understand about what happened in Consort Cao's quarters that night. It was not a coup. Nobody in that room was trying to seize the throne. There was no faction behind them, no prince waiting in the wings, no promise of power on the far side of the emperor's death. What put the cord in Yang Jin-ying's hands was not ambition, it was desperation. These were people at the very bottom of the most rigid hierarchy on earth, with no exit, no appeal, and no future they could bear. And they made a calculation that killing the man at the top was less frightening than another day of serving him. That is the hardest fact of the whole affair. The plot was born entirely of his cruelty. He built the desperation that nearly killed him. And it nearly did. Return to the room and to the seconds on which the Ming dynasty briefly turned. The women had planned it as far as people with no training in violence could plan such a thing. While some held the emperor down against the bed, Yang Jin-ying looped the cord around his throat and pulled. But in the dark, in terror, working against a struggling man, the knot she had tied was the wrong kind. Instead of a noose that tightened as it was drawn, it was a knot that jammed, that would close only so far and then hold. The emperor stopped moving. To the women pulling on the rope, that must have looked like death. It was not. He had fainted, choked into unconsciousness by a cord that could not quite finish its work. Then the plot came apart, and it came apart from the inside. One of the conspirators, a palace woman named Yang Jin-ying, lost her nerve. Perhaps she saw the knot hold and understood that the emperor was only senseless, not dead, and that when he woke there would be a reckoning beyond imagining. Whatever moved her, she broke from the room and ran, not to raise a general alarm, but to reach the one person who could act. She went to the empress. The empress was named Fang, Jiajing's principal wife. Woken in the dark and told that the emperor was being murdered by his own attendants, she moved at once. She raised the household, sent for help, and had the emperor carried out and tended. He was alive, but barely. He could not speak. He lay unconscious for the better part of a day and a half, his throat crushed and his body in shock, while the empire held its breath around a man who could not tell them whether he would live. What brought him back was the nerve of a single physician, an imperial doctor working on an emperor who could not consent and could not respond, gambled on a violent purgative, a drastic intervention that might have killed a weakened man outright. It was an enormous risk. To dose the unconscious body of the Son of Heaven with a purge and to be wrong was to be the man who killed the emperor. But the doctor judged that doing nothing was the greater danger, and he was right. The emperor stirred and vomited and slowly, over hours, came back to himself. For one long day and night, the fate of the Ming Empire had rested not on its armies or its walls or its vast bureaucracy, but on the judgment of one physician standing over a silent man. While the emperor lay unable to speak, someone had to act in his name, and that someone was Empress Fang. Here the story opens into its second, darker layer, because the empress did not only save him, she also seized the moment. With the emperor incapacitated and unable to give orders, she moved to crush the plot with the full and final weight of the law. She ordered the 16 palace women put to death, and with them the consorts she named as implicated under the harshest provisions of the Ming Code. The order was given and it was carried out. The executions are a single grim fact and the record leaves it there. But inside that fact sits an injustice that the emperor himself would come to see and never forgive. Among those the empress condemned was Consort Cao, the woman in whose quarters the emperor had been sleeping. By most accounts, Cao was innocent. Her only connection to the plot was that it had happened in her rooms, that the emperor had chosen her bed that night. She had not planned it and had not taken part, but the empress named her anyway, and the traditional reading of the affair is unambiguous about why. It was jealousy. Cao was a favored consort, and the chaos of the plot handed the empress a pretext to be rid of a rival while wearing the mask of justice. A woman was put to death for the crime of being the one the emperor had chosen to sleep beside. When Jiajing recovered enough to understand what had been done in his name, he grasped this too. He understood that his empress had used the night not only to save him, but to settle her own scores, and that an innocent woman had died for it. He never forgave her. The marriage, in any meaningful sense, was over, and 5 years later, in 1547, the resentment reached its cold conclusion. Empress Fang was trapped in a fire that broke out in the palace. Word reached the emperor that she could be saved. He refused to allow the rescue. He let her burn. The woman who had pulled him back from death was left to die in it, because he had never stopped blaming her for the death of the one he had chosen. But that reckoning lay in the future. In the immediate aftermath of the plot, the emperor was left with something no amount of power could repair. his nerve was gone. He had learned, in the most intimate way possible, that the danger was not over the wall or beyond the gate. It was in the room. It wore the uniform of his own household and stood close enough to touch him. And so he did the one thing that might let him sleep again. He left. The emperor abandoned the Forbidden City. He moved out of the great palace complex entirely to a compound called the West Park, Shiyuan, which lay just west of the palace walls, around the lakes in the area that today borders Zhongnanhai. And he did not go for a season or a year. He stayed. He lived and ruled from the West Park for roughly the next 24 years, from 1542 until near the end of his life in 1566. For the better part of 2 decades, the Emperor of China governed his empire from outside the walls of the palace that had been built to be the center of the world, because he would not sleep again in the place where his own servants had put a cord around his neck. Think about the scale of that decision. The Forbidden City was not simply a house. It was the ritual and administrative heart of the dynasty, the stage on which the whole theater of imperial power was performed. To rule from outside, it was to break with centuries of practice, to hold the empire at arm's length from its own ceremonial core. And Jiajing did it without hesitation and without return for 24 years, rather than face another night in those rooms. It is perhaps the most complete measure of what the plot did to him. It did not take his throne or his life. It took his willingness to live where an emperor was supposed to live. At the West Park, the isolation deepened into something close to a private world. Freed from the daily rituals of the Forbidden City, and more absorbed than ever in his Taoist pursuit of immortality, the emperor withdrew from the ordinary machinery of government. Day-to-day power did not vanish in his absence. It flowed to whoever controlled access to the secluded emperor, and in these years that meant a small circle of Taoist priests and favored grand secretaries who could reach him when the rest of the court could not. An emperor who will see almost no one hands enormous leverage to the few he will see. Petitions, appointments, the business of the empire, all of it now had to pass through the narrow channel of men trusted enough to be admitted to the West Park. The plot had been meant to end the emperor. Instead, it remade the geography of his power, pulling it out of the great public halls and into a guarded compound where a handful of intermediaries stood between the throne and the world. And around the emperor's sleep, the precautions hardened into a permanent architecture. This is where the famous legend has its root. The claim you may have heard is neat and memorable, that the Emperor of China never slept in the same room twice, never lay down in the same bed on 2 nights running, so that no one could ever predict where to find him. It is a wonderful story. It is also not, in its literal form, something the record supports. What the record supports is more measured and, in a way, more revealing. It is not a slogan about never repeating a room. It is a system of deliberate unpredictability built into the very design of imperial sleeping quarters. The multi-bed chambers were real. The curtained alcoves were real. The practice of keeping the emperor's chosen sleeping spot concealed, known to as few people as possible, was real. Consorts summoned to attend the emperor at night were brought and returned under escort, lodged separately, never left with free access to where he slept. The genuine, documented reality is a sleeping arrangement engineered so that the answer to the question, "Where is the emperor tonight?" was a secret held by a tiny handful of people and changed often enough that it could not be relied upon by anyone planning harm. The distance between those two things matters. The paranoia was real. The slogan is legend. Jiajing did not follow a magic rule that he must never touch the same pillow twice. He lived inside a security apparatus of many beds, hidden choices, and layered attendants. And out of that documented apparatus, the popular imagination distilled the tidy, dramatic formula of the room never used twice. The formula is the story people remember because it is easy to say. The truth is the system, and the system is the more honest monument to his fear, because it was designed and built and staffed, and it outlasted him by centuries. For the practice did not die with Jiajing. It became part of how the empire housed its rulers, carried forward and refined long after the Ming gave way to the Qing. When the Qing emperors took the Forbidden City, they eventually moved their own principal residence away from the old palace of heavenly purity to a different hall, the Hall of Mental Cultivation, Yang Jin-ying. And there the same logic appears again in stone and timber. The hall's sleeping quarters contain 5 bedrooms, 1 central and 4 flanking, each fitted with a heated platform bed. Once again, the emperor had not one bed but several, and once again his actual sleeping place on any given night was a matter of concealment rather than routine. The threat that Jiajing had felt in Consort Cao's rooms in 1542 was still shaping the blueprints of imperial residences generations later. The Qing added their own machinery of control around the emperor's knights, a system as bureaucratic as anything in the empire. When a Qing emperor chose a consort to attend him, the choice was registered through name tablets, and the woman was brought to him and taken away again by eunuchs, under supervision and within limits of time. Nothing about the emperor's most private hours was left to chance or to trust. Every approach was logged, escorted, and controlled. The inner court had absorbed the lesson of the Renyan plot into its permanent routine. The people closest to the emperor were the ones who had to be watched most closely of all. That is the true architecture behind the legend. Not a superstition about never repeating a room, but a standing apparatus of decoys and secrecy and supervision, running for the rest of the imperial age, built on the memory of a night when the apparatus had not yet existed and had very nearly not been needed again. Back in his own time, the emperor who set all of this in motion lived on at the West Park for year after year, deeper and deeper into ritual and elixir and isolation. The pursuit of immortality that had helped drive his servants to desperation now consumed his own days. He composed Taoist prayers, kept company with the priests who promised him longer life, and consumed the very elixirs prepared for that purpose, compounds that the alchemy of the age believed could extend a man's years without end. There is a bitter possibility folded into that, one the histories have long suspected. The elixirs of Ming alchemy were not gentle. Many were compounded from minerals and metals that we now know to be poisonous, substances that could accumulate in the body and slowly damage it. The very medicines the emperor took to escape death may have been shortening his life. A man who had survived a cord around his throat, who had rebuilt his entire existence around staying alive, may have been quietly poisoning himself in the name of immortality, one dose at a time. Whether or not the elixirs hastened it, the end came in the winter of 1567. In January of that year, the Jiajing Emperor died at the West Park, still outside the walls of the Forbidden City, in the compound he had made his refuge for 24 years. He was around 59. He had reigned for 45 years, from 1521 to 1567, one of the longest reigns of the entire Ming dynasty, and he had spent well over half of it as a man in flight from his own palace. Consider the shape of that life. He had come to the throne as a boy of 14, an outsider hauled in from the provinces, and he had fought the whole apparatus of his court to a standstill to prove that he, and not they, held power. He had won. And then, at the height of that power, in the middle of his own reign, 16 unarmed women had shown him how little the winning was worth, how thin the wall between the Son of Heaven and any other mortal, how the entire towering structure of his authority came down, in the end, to whether the person standing over his bed wished him alive or dead. He spent the rest of his years answering that question with architecture and distance, and he died having never really answered it at all, because the fear never left him. He simply moved it further from the walls. He was buried, as Ming emperors were, in the great imperial tombs north of Beijing, laid to rest with the full ceremony that his life had increasingly avoided. The man who would not sleep in his own palace was given an eternal residence built to the grandest scale the dynasty could manage. In death, he returned, in a sense, to the ceremonial world he had abandoned in life. The rituals he had fled reclaimed him at the last. For the people caught up in the plot, the aftermath had been settled a quarter of a century before he died. The 16 palace women were gone by the end of 1542. Yang Jin-ying, whose hands had held the cord, and Yang Jin-ying, whose nerve had broken and whose flight had doomed them all, both perished in the reckoning that followed the plot, alongside the consorts the Empress had named. Consort Cao, in whose quarters the whole thing had unfolded, and who by most accounts had done nothing, died with them. Whatever grievances had driven the women, whatever calculations Empress Fang had folded into her verdict, all of it was closed inside a matter of days, and the inner court simply went on, restaffed and rewatched, as though the machinery had never faltered. Empress Fang herself outlived her victims by only 5 years before the fire of 1547, and the emperor's cold refusal ended her. And so within a single reign, nearly every named person at the center of that November night was dead. The attackers, the frightened woman who ran, the innocent consort, the empress who judged them, all gone, leaving only the emperor to carry the memory alone into his walled retreat and to build around it the system that would outlast every one of them. What the affair left behind was not vengeance or reform. It was habit, hardened into stone. The women who died left almost nothing of themselves in the record beyond their names and their one act. There are no portraits of Yang Jin-ying, no account in her own words of what drove her to braid that cord, no defense, no last statement that survives. The empire that documented so much of its own machinery, that logged the stipends and the ranks and the movements of consorts in careful ledgers, kept only the barest outline of the people at the bottom of it. We know that they were beaten. We know that they were hungry. We know that they decided, together, in the dark, that the risk of the cord was worth taking. Everything else about them has been swallowed by the same silence that swallowed most of the palace women of the Ming, the tens of thousands of unnamed servants who kept the inner court alive across 3 centuries and left barely a trace. That silence is itself part of the story. The Renyan plot is remembered not because the empire chose to remember the women, but because it could not hide what had nearly happened to the emperor. The attempt forced its way into the record by its sheer audacity, an assault on the Son of Heaven that could not be quietly erased. And so, almost by accident, the desperation of 16 palace women became one of the few moments when the people at the very bottom of the imperial system reached up and touched the man at the very top, and the record was compelled to notice them. What the record preserved most carefully, though, was not the women. It was the response. The layered attendants, the concealed sleeping places, the escorted comings and goings, the multiple beds behind their curtains. All of this was written into the routine of the palace and carried forward as ordinary practice, generation after generation. Long after anyone at court could have told you the name Yang Jin-ying, the emperors of China were still sleeping inside the shape of her failed attack, in rooms designed so that no one could be sure which bed held the emperor. The plot was forgotten as a human event and remembered as a set of precautions. The people vanished, and the fear became furniture. And that furniture is still standing. The Forbidden City is a museum now, one of the most visited places on Earth, drawing many millions of people through its gates every year. They come along the same central axis the emperors walked, past the great throne halls, through the courtyards, where the whole theatre of imperial power was once staged. And among the halls they file through is the Hall of Mental Cultivation, where the later emperors slept, and where the sleeping quarters survive with their small curtained beds, still in place behind the glass and the barriers. The visitors move through in a slow current, cameras up, guidebooks open, pausing where the crowd pauses. They photograph the throne, the calligraphy, the imperial yellow of the roof tiles. And when they reach the sleeping alcoves, they see what the design was always meant to show and to hide at once. Not one grand bed for the most powerful man in the country, but several modest ones, curtained and close, tucked into their partitions. Always several, never one. Most people walk past without asking why. It looks at a glance like a quirk of old furniture or the simple abundance of a rich household with rooms to spare. The little beds photograph well. They read as quaint. Almost no one standing at the barrier connects the multiplicity of those beds to anything darker than decoration. And there is no plaque that traces them back to a November night in a consort's quarters, to a cord tied with the wrong knot, to 16 hungry women who decided that killing the emperor was worth the risk. But that is what those beds are. They are the fear made permanent. Each empty curtained alcove is a decoy, a piece of a security system disguised as a bedroom, the descendant of the terror that drove one emperor out of these very walls for the last 24 years of his life. The tourists photographing them are looking, without knowing it, at the physical memory of the day the palace failed to protect the man at its center, and at the elaborate, centuries-long answer the empire built so that it would not fail again. There is one more turn worth sitting with before the story closes, and it is the quiet irony at the heart of the whole arrangement. Everything Jiajing built to keep himself safe was an admission of how unsafe absolute power really was. A peasant slept behind a single door and trusted the dark. The Emperor of China could not. His wealth bought him not rest but vigilance, not a bed but a system of beds, not solitude but a permanent audience of watchers watching one another. He had more control over the lives of more people than almost any human being who has ever lived, and he could not lie down at night and be sure of waking. The multiplication of his beds was the exact measure of how little his power was worth in the one room where he could not be a god, only a sleeping man with a throat. And the people who taught him that were not enemies of the state, not rival princes or foreign agents or scheming ministers. They were the women who folded his robes and carried his water, the ones the whole vast apparatus of guards and walls and moats was never designed to stop, because it had never occurred to the men who built it that the danger might come from the hands that served. That was the blind spot no architecture could fully close. You can hide which bed a man sleeps in. You cannot fully hide from the people who make it. November 1542. A man asleep in a room that was not his own, because even the choice of a bed had become a secret meant to keep him alive. A cord in the dark, and a knot tied wrong, and a morning he was never supposed to see. Everything that followed grew from those few seconds. The flight from the palace, the years behind the West Park walls, the beds that multiply behind their curtains to this day. The most powerful man on earth learned, with a rope at his throat, that power is not the same as safety, and he spent the rest of his life proving it, one hidden bed at a time. The women who taught him that lesson are gone almost without trace, but the fear they put in him is still standing in the Forbidden City, curtained and quiet. Always several beds, never one, waiting for the next crowd to walk past and never think to ask why.